read something to you from 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3, Paul writes this, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come." So he's speaking about the last days and the fact that there'll be perilous times. He says, "For," so he gives us the reason why that is. Why will they be perilous times? Why will the last days be perilous times? "For men," or mankind, people, "will be lovers of themselves." Check, right? We see that today in our society. "Lovers of money." Check. "Boasters." Check. "Proud." Check. "Blasphemers." Check. "Disobedient to parents." You guys wouldn't know anything about that, but, check. "Unthankful." "Unholy." "Unloving." "Unforgiving." "Slanderers." "Without self-control." "Brutal." "Despisers of good." "Traitors." "Headstrong." "Haughty." "Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." "Having a form of godliness but denying its power." And then he goes on to say, "And from such people turn away." I don't know if you caught it, but in there at the end of verse 2, or near the end of verse 2, he actually includes in that list of last days, perilous times, characteristics, he actually said unthankful. Isn't that crazy? That he would include the word or that characteristic of being unthankful as part of one of the characteristics that would describe the last days, perilous times. Being unthankful. And yet I think, I would imagine that you, like me, we oftentimes find ourselves being unthankful for things that we have or things that we've received, or, well, I'm thankful for it, but, I wish there was more, I wish it was better. And we want to make sure that we keep ourselves in check in this area. We're heading toward an American holiday, really. It's called Thanksgiving. We all know that. It's coming up in a few Thursdays here. But what about that? Is it all just about eating? All of us sitting here are old enough, mature enough to understand it's not just about eating. Yeah, that's a big part of the actual day, but you got family time, but really giving thanks. And so this past Wednesday, we started a new series called 7 Psalms for Giving Thanks. So we'll be covering 7 Psalms. We'll cover a psalm on Wednesday night and on Sunday. And so on Wednesday night, we started Psalm 18. And today we're in Psalm 30. And so we'll continue on with this series as we head ever closer to the holiday, Thanksgiving. But what this will do is, if we are engaged in what we're hearing as we're learning each week, this will develop a heart of thanksgiving or giving of thanks, and so that we can be thankful on that day, but even beyond that day. We want to be people that are thankful to the Lord for all that we have, and even thankful to the Lord for what we do not have. In Psalm chapter 30, we have in verse 1, it tells us exactly what this is. It is a psalm or a song. And it says that it is a song at the dedication of the house of David. And so we would assume, although it doesn't say that David was the one that wrote it, I think it's clear, or at least it's a very, very, very good guess, that it was David that wrote it, because it was at the dedication of his own house. Now, let me read something to you from 2 Samuel, jumping all over the place, but we will be in Psalm 30. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, for those of you that like to take notes. It's a little bit of background. 2 Samuel 5, 11 through 12 says, "Then Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and carpenters, and masons." Now, it's a bit comical, or at least it is for me, the way my strange mind works, that he sent messengers to David. Nowadays we send a message, man, and it's instant, right? You can send a text message or a voice message or a video message. Can you imagine getting a message from someone and it comes with cedar trees and carpenters and masons? You're like, man, this is quite a message. But it says there at the end of verse 11 in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 11, "And they built David a house. So David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. So this psalm, we are told, was written for the dedication of the house of David. It's a little bit funny because as we go through these verses, and there are only 12 verses here, you're going to notice that there is not a word mentioned about anyone's house, let alone David's house. There's no word of any house or of a house being built. But what we find in the background in 2 Samuel chapter 5 is that at this point of David's life, and he had, just before those verses in 2 Samuel chapter 5, we get the account of him going in and conquering Jerusalem, taking it from the Jebusites, who should have been long gone. And you and I know that because we've been studying through the book of Joshua, and we know that there were still people left in the land. And so there were still Jebusites there who were living in Jerusalem. But he went into Jerusalem, he overtook the Jebusites, and he set up his kingdom there. That was the center of it. And we're told that it was there that he gets this message, and they build him a house. Now, at that point of his house being built, understand, why would he write a psalm for this dedication of the house? And that's because prior to his house being built there by Hiram, king of Tyre, prior to this, he really was somewhat of a nomad. He was always on the move. He had spent many, many years on the run. If you were here on Wednesday night, you know that he had spent time running from Saul, several years running for his life from King Saul. And so he's really been somewhat of a nomad on the move. But as they build him a house there, it's at the building of that house, the establishing of a home for him and his family, that David in verse 12 of 2 Samuel chapter 5 says, so David knew that the Lord had established him. There's something about being in a home and being with your family, or being it could even be an apartment, but being somewhere and having some kind of home or some kind of roof, some kind of a dwelling. What does that do? It provides comfort. Why comfort? Well, it's the knowledge that, hey, I've got some place to lay down and sleep and rest. I've got some form of safety. If you've got your family there, obviously that's a comforting feeling. So it was at this point, as his house is built, that he's going to dedicate it. They're going to dedicate this house. It was at that point that David knew. Now he was sure, or at least reassured, we might say, because he knew that the Lord was leading his life and had called him to be king. He understood all of those things. But it was when he had his own house here built that he knew that the Lord had established him. And when we have some ownership of things, then we're certain of that. You all are in the process of learning some very valuable lessons. Some of you have jobs of your own, or you sell things, or you provide some service, mowing lawns or babysitting, or some of you might make jewelry. I know some of you make jewelry and you sell it. Some of you have really your own businesses, which is pretty incredible. And you're learning a valuable lesson. You're learning the difference now of what it means to have something given to you, handed to you, and what it means to earn it. And when you've earned it, when it's yours, and you go, what, I've got some ownership over this thing, then it becomes like, what, this is mine. And there's some comfort in that, some assurance in that. That's a good thing. But for David, obviously his house was built for him because he was the king of Israel, as we read there in verse 12. But it's his home. He's got ownership over it. And it's at that point that he's reminded, he's got this reassurance, assured and reassured, that the Lord had established him. Okay, it's time to settle down now here. And so we read in verse 12 of 2 Samuel chapter 5, so David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Not for his own sake, not for his own service, but for the service. David was a servant leader servant king. And so he knew that he had been established and had this home and had this kingdom so that he could serve his people, God's people, Israel. And so it's at this point that Psalm 30 is written and no doubt sung at the dedication. Now, what is it exactly that they were doing in dedicating the house? What do you dedicate the house? Well, it's a dedicating of the house to the service of the Lord. Maybe it was dedicated to David also because he was the king. But ultimately, and David knows this, that it was dedicated to the glory of the Lord, to the service of the Lord, to the service of the people. It was a home so that David would have some comfort and some safety from which he could then serve the Lord, serve his people. And so in dedicating the house, we have different pictures in the Bible of things being dedicated. Oftentimes it was worship. Certainly would be prayer. But it brings up, before we even get into finish getting into the text here, it brings up an important point and a question for you. What do you have that you can dedicate to the Lord? Now, you do not own a house. There's a good chance that your parents don't own a house. It's a good chance that they'll probably own that house, 40 years from now or something, and then they'll own it and then they'll die and they'll leave it to you and then you'll sell it. It's hard to own a house nowadays. They're expensive. You pay for many, many years. But what do you have? Do you have a room? And maybe you haven't paid for that room, but maybe it's your room. It's been set aside as your room, and that's your room. And whatever it is that you have, I would encourage you, and David here through this passage would encourage us, dedicate that to the Lord. What do you have? You know what you have? You have your life, your youth, your time, your breath, your strength. Right now, you've got the ability to, walk and move and run and, do all of those things. Dedicate that to the Lord. Use that to serve God. Thank you, God, so much for the abilities that I have, the physical abilities that I have. And help me, Lord, please. I want to use what I have for your glory. That's what David was doing with his house. Now, let me give you a breakdown because I know that some of you like to take notes. Here's how it is broken down, or at least how I broke it down. Psalm 30, verses 1 through 5 is praise. And then in verses 6 through 12, he will give us some proof as to why he's praising God. Now, he's obviously going to give us some reasons here in the beginning as to why he's praising. But then he will also give us proof or an example from his own life, actually, about why he believes that God is so good and why he would be dedicating his house. Now, let's get into the first section here in verses 1 through 5 of Psalm 30. And it begins this way. I will extol. That's a neat word. I will extol in verse 1. That means to praise enthusiastically. It means that he was very excited, that he was praising God loudly, excitedly, enthusiastically. We oftentimes are very, very reserved in our worship. And it's for a couple of reasons. One of them is because our pastor who's leading the church here, he is reserved in his worship. And so that just trickles on down to all the different ministries and things. We've got some freedom, to clap our hands and move around a little bit. And, there are some churches that have the freedom to clap and shout and run around the room. That doesn't happen to be us. That's whether that's good or bad is not for me to determine right now. But, we're just a little more reserved in our worship. But some of us are very, very reserved. David, oftentimes, you see examples of him worshiping God loudly and praising him. It's not uncommon to go through some of these Psalms where David is praising the Lord, or one of the other authors, and to see exclamation marks at the end of the sentence, where someone is shouting, someone's yelling. There was dancing involved. There was loud cymbals. There were instruments. It was enthusiastic. And David here, in using this word extol, I will extol, he says, I will praise enthusiastically. I'll be excited when I praise. And he's talking directly to God. I will extol you. See that? The language is going to change in this psalm. Pay attention. I'll try to remember to point it out. But I will praise enthusiastically you. I will praise you enthusiastically, we would say. And then he tells us exactly who he's talking about. Oh, Lord. So we know that he's talking to the Lord. We know that he's talking to God. And then he tells us, he uses the word for, F-O-R. And that is the word we would say because. So I will extol you, O Lord, because, and then he tells us why. You have lifted me up. Now, what does it mean by that? You have lifted me up. He goes on to say, and have not let my foes rejoice over me. In a few minutes, he'll mention a mountain and the fact that he made his mountain firm. But here, you've lifted me up. What does he mean by that? Well, as he sees his house built, and he's dedicating this house to the Lord and understanding that, okay, I've really been on the move for many, many years, but now I've got a home. This kingdom is established, and I'm the king, and I'm going to serve these people. And he's considering all of that. He realizes that it was God that lifted him up to that position. Do you and I understand that? That whatever position you may hold in your family or at school or on your team, wherever you're at, it was God who lifted you up to that position. David understands that. He's not the king by accident. He's not the king because he necessarily even chose to be. He's the king because when he was a boy, a prophet came to his house and said, hey, God's choosing you to be the next king. And so he understands, and it's been a long road getting to this point here where we're at in Psalm 30 or 2 Samuel chapter 5. It's been a long road, but he understands that it was God. That process was God's. It was God that was leading him to the position that he's at. And you and I must make sure that we understand that. I am not a baseball fan. All of you know that. You know, I think I only watch soccer. I really don't watch anything else. It really just so happens that I think it was game 1 of the World Series, this past World Series, my wife and I were at home, and we had just gotten home from somewhere, and she mentioned the game, and I thought, oh yeah, let's put this thing on and see what, the hype is all about. Now, you do need to understand, I played baseball for many, many years of my life. In fact, until I got to high school, then I stopped. But I used to watch baseball and football and, and so I'm somewhat familiar with baseball, obviously. But I turned it on, and I turned it on just in time to see the Grand Slam, the Dodgers Grand Slam. And it was like, man, this is exciting. But I've sat at baseball games. I've gone to actual baseball, Angels and Dodgers or whoever, and sat there and almost fallen asleep or whatever. But, watching it was like, man, this is exciting. I was told, and I do not know, some of you are Dodgers fans, man, and you're like, yeah, Dodgers or death, I am told, I heard a story about Ohtani. Is that how you pronounce his name? Ohtani? I was told that when he played in Japan, I think it was his high school coach, that his high school coach used to make them, all the players, clean the toilets. Is that accurate? Yeah. What an incredible thought. And my son, who's been to Japan a couple of times, has told me that it's still, not necessarily for Ohtani, but for the Japanese people, that's still like, that's a big deal, for people to clean toilets and keep everything clean. But because what it does is it keeps you in the right frame of mind, right? Because I may be the world's, most popular athlete in whatever sport I'm playing, but to always remember that, hey, but I could clean a mean toilet. It's a good thing because we go way up and then we come way back down to where we belong. We understand that, the position that I have, if I may be the world's most popular athlete, if I lose my job, I get some kind of injury, well, at least I can always go back to clean toilets. But keeping that balance, David understands here, you have lifted me up. He acknowledges that. It was God who got him to the position that he was in. He didn't do it himself. You and I must be careful that we're not prideful about where we're at, but that all that we have comes from the Lord. He says this, for you have lifted me up and have not let my foes rejoice over me. You understand the picture there? It was you who lifted me up so that my enemies were not able to get above me, get the upper hand. They were not able to rejoice over me. But he's the one that's on top. He's been lifted up. It was a God who preserved his life when it was Saul and other men that were trying to take his life. He goes on in verse 2 to say, "O Lord my God, I cried out to you, and you healed me." And in verse 3, "O Lord, you brought my soul up from the grave. You have kept me alive, that I should not go down to the pit." So what I titled these first 3 verses here, subpoints, is salvation. He's praising God for salvation. Notice in verse 1, he saved him from his enemies. In verse 2, he saved him from sickness. And in verse 3, he saved him from death. You brought my soul up from the grave. So David is saying, man, there was a point in my life where I was low and I just felt like I was in the grave. I mean, I was there at death's doorstep. You have kept me alive. It was God that preserved me. I love when David says in the Psalms, I lay down, I slept, I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. Very, very simple. I lay down, I slept. We got those 2 down, right? I can lay down and I can sleep. Especially nowadays. It's been busy. I'm old. Laying down, it's like, you better be careful. You know, I rarely go to the movies anymore. Not necessarily because I'm just so holy and I don't watch sinful movies. It's because if I go to the movies, it's a good chance I'm going to fall asleep and miss that movie. Especially now, you know, you get recliners and couches and, you know, they'll bring food to you. It's like a bad combo, man. I lay down, David said. I slept, I awoke, and then he acknowledges, for the Lord sustained me. And here it's that same thought. Like, I was down low, but you kept me alive. And then he says at the end of verse 3 that I should not go down to the pit. Essentially what he's saying in our modern day terms, our New Testament terms, we would say, David would say, you kept me from going to death, or you kept me from going to hell. You kept me from dying. That's what he's saying. You kept me from going down to the pit. So he was praising God for salvation. But then in verses 4 and 5, he praises God for God's favor on him. Verse 4, sing praise to the Lord. Now notice the language changed. At first he was talking to God. Now he talks to everybody else and he says, sing praise to the Lord. He's telling everybody, this is what you need to do. You need to sing praise to the Lord, you saints of his. Now, I come from a Catholic background. I grew up thinking I was a Catholic. I really was not a good Catholic at all. But when I went to church, growing up, when I went to church, it was to the Catholic church. I wouldn't go to those weird Christian churches because they clapped during worship. You know, they were so strange. And they would read their Bibles. It was weird. But saints, we're familiar with that term. Again, for me, from Catholicism, saints were individuals that had met certain criteria and had been given sainthood after their death because they had, you know, somebody had prayed in their name and a miracle had been performed. There was different things, different criteria that had to be met. But that's actually not the biblical meaning of that word at all. Saints means to be sanctified, means to be set apart for God's service. That's what he means by saints. And so he says, sing praise to the Lord, you saints of his. You're a saint of God's. You're his. So, what should you be doing? Well, David says that we should be praising the Lord. Sing praise to the Lord, you saints of his. And give thanks at the remembrance of his name, or some translations may say his holiness and not his holy name, but whether it's his holiness or his holy name. But did you notice what David said there at the second part of verse 4? That we should give thanks at the remembrance of his holy name. Now again, some of us may go, well, what do I have to be thankful for? You know, it's quite embarrassing, but I'll share it with you. When I was younger and before I got saved when I was 20 years old, okay? So when I was your age, I was not saved. And the military recruiters would call, you know, from time to time and, you know, hey, is this Chris Amore? Yes, it is. Yeah, well, hey, this is, you know, my name is so-and-so. I'm from this branch of the military. And, you know, what are you going to be doing after graduation? I was in a different, I'm telling you, I wasn't saved. I prefaced that, but this story by saying I wasn't saved. So I was in a different mindset. But I remember telling the recruiters often, I'm not joining the military. Well, why not? Why don't you want to consider it? And I would say, well, what has this country ever done for me? Which is absurd. I was born in I believe, I've been to a few other countries, not a bunch, but this is the greatest country in the world. I didn't say it was perfect. I said among the countries, among all the imperfect countries, this is the greatest. We've got freedom here. There's a lot. And my dad came here when he was a little boy from Mexico. He was an immigrant. And so I was first generation born, from him, first generation born in the U.S. And but I had an ungrateful attitude, and I would tell the recruit, "What has this country ever done for me? I'm not going to go serve." That's one of my biggest regrets. I've got lots of regrets, but that was one of the biggest. Here, David says, we want to sing praise and give thanks. Now, if you were here on Wednesday night, this may sound a little bit familiar. Let me show you why. In Psalm 18:49, again, which we studied on Wednesday night, David said, "Therefore I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the Gentiles, and sing praises to your name." Notice, it's flipped, but he says, I'm going to do two things, Lord. I'm going to give thanks, and I'm going to sing praises. Here in Psalm 30, verse 4, it's the opposite way, but it's two things. I'm going to sing praise, and I'm going to give thanks. But he's telling the people, you need to sing praise to the Lord, you saints of his, and you need to give thanks to the remembrance of his holy name, or to his holiness. So you need to sing his praises, and you need to give thanks. And some of us, to be honest, struggle with both of those. We have opportunities every Sunday and Wednesday to come in here and to worship God corporately. That means together. And some of us sit still. We do not open our mouths. We do not sing praises to the Lord. And some of us are struggling with being thankful. We look at our lives and we say, oh, man, I don't know. I don't know why I only have 5 pairs of shoes. That just doesn't seem fair. We look at not what we have, but what we don't have. Where David here is saying we need to do two things. We need to sing praises, and we need to be thankful. We've got to be thankful. Why? Why would I be thankful? Well, he tells us here in verse 4, at the remembrance of his holy name or his holiness. It's not even necessarily for anything that you own. It's just because God is holy. And so I ought to be thankful for that. There's a lot that goes along with that, because God is holy. He's in the process of making me holy. A lot of things that he's providing. He's already told us prior to this that I ought to be thankful because I've been saved. I ought to be thankful because God saved me from my enemies, or he healed me, or he brought my soul up from the grave. I mean, all of us in this room survived COVID. You know that not everybody did, right? When it first broke out in 2020, you remember that. Not everybody survived. I've got in my office, I've got a few pictures in there of funerals that I officiated of these guys that were younger than me that died from the effects of COVID. And one of my very, very good friends, who was just a little bit older than me, who died. And all of those 3 or 4 men that I have in there, they sit there. I look at them whenever I'm in my office. I look across and I'll look at these men to remember that these guys lost their lives. And out of those guys that I have there, a few of them, again, were younger than me. You need to remember that not everybody survived that. People die every day on the freeways, just all over the place. We need to be thankful. We need to be thankful that we're still here, that God has preserved us. Now he goes on, and again he's talking about his favor, and here we see it clearly in verse 5. Let me go back to our points. Where are we at? Oh, I am so sorry. You know what? Forget that. Let's go back and pretend like we never saw that. I'll show you that in just a minute. Look at verse 5. He says, for, again, because. Why should I praise? For his anger is but for a moment. His favor, there it is for life. Weeping, this is a popular verse. You've probably heard this before. Weren't sure where it was at. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. He's pointing out some aspects of his favor. And part of that is that his anger, there are times when God gets angry. Yes. There are times when God disapproves of our actions or our attitudes, things that we do or things that we say. But it's for a moment. We'll talk about why that is when we get a little bit further into our study. But his favor is for life. It's forever. His anger is but for a moment. His favor is for life. For life. Weeping, because of sadness, obviously, because of hardships, difficulties, times of testing, sickness, worry. Weeping may endure for a night, and it may go through the night. Some of you may understand that, what it's like to just cry all night long in your bed, wishing that something hadn't happened or wasn't going to happen. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. In other words, what he's saying is that the weeping, hardships, that they're hard. And sometimes they do seem to last a long time. But they do eventually end. And joy comes in the morning. Why? Well, it works this way because his anger is for a moment, but his favor is for life. His favor is for life. Now, let me show you what I had up here, and I told you, but just pretend you didn't see. Look at Isaiah chapter 54, verse 7. Look what it says here on the screen. For a mere moment, God says, I have forsaken you, but with great mercies I will gather you. So there are those times in our lives where it seems like we don't have the favor of God. Like, I don't think that God is happy with me. I feel like he's disciplining me. And that may be absolutely true because he does discipline us. But understand that it's for a mere moment. It's just for a moment. It's temporary. But what is long-lasting, what is forever, is that his great mercies. He says, with great mercies I will gather you. I love David in Psalm 51 said, have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. The multitude of your tender mercies. Multitude. Isn't that incredible? A multitude of your tender mercies. And so for a mere moment I have forsaken you, but with great mercies I will gather you. Yes, there are times of discipline in our lives. And David was well acquainted with discipline because he made mistakes and God had to discipline him. He was well aware of that. And by the way, this dedication and this psalm were written before what happened with Bathsheba. And so, yeah, he was a sinner. He was a sinner, and it wasn't the first time and it wasn't the last time, and he understood, but he also understood the goodness of God. What a wonderful thought. Now, we move on to our second main division, which is the proof. Let's see if we can get there. There we are. Verses 6 through 12, proof. Now, you'll see this conversation that David kind of has with himself, but he knows that he's still talking to the Lord. He's talking to the people. Here he's going to talk to the Lord in just a moment. But I think that in verse 6, he's describing or he's explaining to the people. He says, now in my prosperity, I said, I shall never be moved. Now, one of the reasons that I really like the book of Psalms, one of the reasons, is because we get a full range of emotions in the book of Psalms. I always love reading Psalms if I'm going to do a hospital visit with somebody, because being in the hospital sick with some disease or sickness, that can, if you're a Christian, that can just have you up and down all over the place. You know that you should have joy, but man, you're feeling horrible, and it can just have you all over the place. Well, the book of Psalms, we find throughout the Psalms, David, he's got the highest highs, but you also see him in the lowest lows. And there are times within the same psalm where he'll say, God, he'll almost be scolding God and saying, why are the wicked people are all prospering? And in the same psalm, he'll go, man, I came to my senses and I understand that God is good and, the wickedness is temporary, but, and you'll see this full range of emotions. Well, here in verse 6 and in verse 7, I love these verses. They may be my favorites here within this passage, this chapter. But he says in verse 6, now in my prosperity I said, I shall never be moved. He's indicating for us that when he was prospering, that he became prideful. That's what I called it there in verse 6. Let me put this up for you, verses 6 and 7. He became prideful in verse 6. And he said, in my prosperity, I'll never be moved. In other words, I'm untouchable, man. I've got money. Nobody can touch me. It's funny, isn't it, when you get some money, maybe you work and you've got some money. It kind of gives you a little bit of confidence. Say, I kind of got it like that. You might save up your money. Maybe it's even from a birthday. You get money, and you might save up money and buy yourself some new J's or some new Air Forces or whatever, whatever your shoe preference is. Nowadays it's, a lot of people back to Adidas, and it kind of bounces back and forth. But maybe you got yourself you got a little bit of money, and now you're kind of like, I don't want to be prideful, but brush your shoulders off, because I kind of got it like that right now. In our prosperity, it's easy to do that, right? In our prosperity. And again, I point this out every so often. We live in Southern California, man. What do we have in Southern California, man? We got sun in Southern California. We got beaches. We got LA. We got Hollywood. We got Maseratis, man. We got Corvettes just up and down the roads, just driving through Menifee. We got money. And in our prosperity, oftentimes, we become prideful and we say, I shall never be moved. Man, I'm untouchable. I've got money. I'm untouchable. And that's what David was thinking there. But then in verse 7, he comes to his senses. And he says, Lord. Now he's talking to the Lord. He says, Lord, by your favor, you have, notice the language, by your favor, you have made my mountain stand strong. He says, it wasn't me. It wasn't my prosperity. It was you, Lord. You did it. And he says, you made my mountain stand strong. Now, he may be giving us an illustration there and picturing his life like he's standing on a mountain and it was God that put him on this mountain. But keep in mind that he's just finished defeating the Jebusites in Jerusalem. Holy, holy Mount Zion. Temple was on a mountain, or would be, and there's hills there, and so it may be that David's looking at his life and going, man, look at me here in Jerusalem, on this hill, in Jerusalem, and it was the Lord that got me here. You've made my mountain stand strong. And then in verse 7, look at this. I told you, he's back and forth. First he said, in my prosperity I said I shall never be moved. But Lord, it was you that got me there. It wasn't my prosperity. And then he says in verse 7, you hid your face and I was troubled. What is he doing? He's giving us the testimony, the story. He's like, yeah, man, I was prospering, and for a moment I thought, hey, I got it like that. I'm prospering and I'm doing so well. I'm untouchable. He says, but in verse 7, but then I realized it was you, Lord. And he says, in fact, you hid your face, and I was troubled. Why would God hide his face from David? Well, again, it was one of those temporary things. In fact, we looked at Isaiah 54:7. Look at this in Isaiah 54:8. Look what he says. With a little wrath, God says, I hid my face from you for a moment. For a moment. But with everlasting kindness. You see that? Momentary was God hiding his face. That pictured as discipline. He says, but with everlasting kindness, I will have mercy on you. It's a declaration. I will have mercy on you, says the Lord, your Redeemer. It was David, or rather God, that had prospered David. There's an old Bible commentator. I'm going to share it with you here. His name is Matthew Henry. Look what he said. He said, if God in wisdom and justice turned from us, that's what we're talking about. If God turns from us for a moment, yet it will be in us the great, it's an old guy. Yet it will be in us the greatest folly and injustice imaginable if we turn from him. So if we sense that I think God has turned from me, it would be the worst possible decision for you and I to go, you know what? God turned from me. I'm turning away from him. He says, no, let us learn to pray in the dark. So even if I am experiencing the dark because of some sin and God is disciplining me by turning his face or his kindness or his goodness from me for a moment, what I need to do is I need to make sure that I'm still trusting him, in him, praying in the dark. And in fact, that leads us to our last point here, which is in verses 8 through 12, that he prayed. He says, I cried out to you. That's praying. I cried out to you, O Lord, and to the Lord I made supplication or request. That's what supplication means. I explained on Wednesday night because we read that same word. Supplication always reminds me of supper. And then when I think of supper, I start thinking of mashed potatoes and gravy and, chicken and, different food, and it just gets me really hungry. But what he's talking about is I made my request. Verse 9, he asked God a couple of questions. Speaking to the Lord, he says, what profit is there in my blood when I go down to the pit? So God, if I die, if you allow me to die, there's no profit in that. He says, will the dust praise you? Will it declare your truth? He's trying to reason with God. He's saying, God, if you don't rescue me, if I die, what's going to happen? Is the dust going to praise you? What he's doing is trying to make the point that, God, keep me alive, because if you keep me alive, I'll praise you. The dust won't, but I will. Verse 10, hear, O Lord. Here he is talking to God. Hear, O Lord, and have mercy on me. Lord, be my helper. You ever struggle in a prayer meeting with I don't know, I'm not really sure what to pray. The other people praying, they sound so good, eloquent. They've got things to be praying that they're praying for. Well, here's a good prayer. Lord, have mercy on me. Lord, be my helper. That's it. That's it. Lord, have mercy on me. And of course, you know that mercy is not getting what you do deserve. You deserve judgment. You deserve punishment. He says, don't do that. Have mercy on me. Lord, be my helper. Who else would you want to help you? Verse 11, you have turned for me my mourning into dancing. There it is, David the Pentecostal. You have put off my sackcloth, which was an itchy garment that they would put on when they were repenting of their sin or when they were mourning. He says, you've put off my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness. That's just the picture of taking off like a potato sack, some kind of bean sack, itchy. You take that off and you just put on some comfortable, cozy cotton jammies. You've clothed me with gladness. Verse 12, to the end that my glory may sing praise to you. You did that, God, so that I would sing praise to you and not be silent. I don't want to be quiet, God. I want to praise you loudly. Oh Lord, my God, I will. Here it is again, our theme, give thanks to you forever. What do we have to be thankful for? We can be thankful for God's salvation, for God's protection of us, his preservation over us, for the fact that he corrects us when we become prideful. We can be thankful for all of those things. But David here teaches us a very valuable lesson as we learn, as we leave, that when we pray, and I've told you this before, when we sin oftentimes, the first thing we do is we want to run away from the Lord. Why do we do that? We sin and we stop coming into church. Because, I feel guilty, I've sinned. Who's going to forgive you? Your math teacher? Your coach? Your mom and dad can't. They may forgive you, but they can't just forgive your sins and wipe them out. Who can forgive your sins and cleanse you? Only God. So David teaches us a valuable lesson that when you sin, run to God, because he can help you. We finish with this. 1 John chapter 2, verse 1 says, my little children, these things I write to you so that you may not sin. It's teaching you how not to sin. And if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous. So if I sin, I've got an advocate. And that advocate is not my school counselor. It's not my football coach. It's not even necessarily my mom and my dad, who can advocate for us and be a tremendous blessing to us. But as far as God is concerned, we have an advocate with the Father. That's Jesus Christ the righteous. So if I sin, Jesus is going to help me. He's going to advocate for me. So if I sin, the lesson is I need to just get myself back to God as quickly as I possibly can. With my sin. Come back and I go, God, here's my sin. Yeah, I'm guilty. Here's my sin. Please forgive me. And he'll cleanse us from all unrighteousness. What a wonderful thought.